Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. After 5 years, Obamacare remains extremely controversial and divisive. Today we get two different perspectives on its strengths and weaknesses. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Journalist Stephen Brill tells us what he learned from his $190,000 open heart surgery. He also pulls back the curtain on money, politics, backroom deals, and the fight to fix our broken healthcare system.
Dr. Jonathan Oberlander is an expert on the political life of Medicare. Is this healthcare program in danger? Can it be sustained for future generations?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the pros and cons of the Affordable Care Act, and what else can be done to get the American healthcare system back on track.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Mediterranean diet has been shown to stave off stroke, heart disease, diabetes, and premature death. Now, a further follow-up of participants in Spain's PREDIMED trial suggests that a Mediterranean diet can also help keep the brain healthy. In the study, people at high risk of cardiovascular disease were randomly assigned to follow a Mediterranean diet with additional extra virgin olive oil, a Mediterranean diet with extra almonds, hazelnuts, and walnuts, or a prudent low-fat diet. More than 400 older volunteers underwent a battery of cognitive tests at the start of the trial. 4 years later, about 300 of them had a second set of cognitive tests. Those who had been assigned to the Mediterranean diet enriched with olive oil scored significantly better on a couple of the tests. People in both Mediterranean diet groups improved their scores slightly on most of the tests. In contrast, the group that had been on a low-fat diet had slipped somewhat in its scores. The researchers concluded, in an older population, a Mediterranean diet supplemented with olive oil or nuts is associated with improved cognitive function.
Have you ever experienced a midday slump? Somewhere between 2 and 4 p.m. it can become difficult to concentrate or even stay awake. Some people go for their second or third cup of coffee to perk up, but a new study shows that high cacao chocolate might have a stimulant effect. The research was supported by the Hershey Company and used EEG technology to measure attention. The study subjects were 122 volunteers between 18 and 25 years old, randomly assigned to consume 60% cacao chocolate or controlled chocolate with lower amounts of cacao compounds. Those getting the 60% cacao chocolate had EEG tracings showing more alertness and better attention. This also corresponded to the way they felt. Although regular consumption of cocoa compounds has been associated with lower blood pressure in previous studies, these researchers found that high cacao chocolate temporarily raised diastolic blood pressure by about 3 to 5 points. The authors speculate that using a 90% cacao chocolate might have produced more striking results on attention, but worried that it might not be palatable to the young adults in the trial.
A surprisingly high proportion of teenagers who suffer concussions on the playing field or as a result of an accident may still be experiencing symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, and trouble concentrating 4 weeks after their injury. A study published in Pediatrics found that 240 out of 349 youngsters who had suffered a concussion were struggling with such symptoms. Those who had symptoms also reported difficulties with schoolwork and studying. Children experiencing mood changes following a concussion were also more likely to have trouble completing homework assignments or taking notes. Teachers and administrators may need to make special allowances for young people who've had such an injury. Accommodations should be tailored to the severity of the symptoms to speed recovery.
Celiac disease has long been perceived as a digestive disorder. That's because the cells that line the small intestine undergo immune system attack. This can lead to nutritional deficiencies because critical vitamins and minerals cannot be adequately absorbed through the damaged lining. A new study from Sweden shows that people with celiac disease are also at increased risk for nerve damage. Rates of neuropathy were about twice as high as those in the general population. That said, the absolute risk for nerve damage was quite low overall. Nevertheless, people who are sensitive to gluten, a protein found in barley, wheat, and rye, need to avoid all foods with gluten to reduce the risk of developing a range of serious complications, including nerve damage.
Some people think they're addicted to sugar. A new study shows they might be right. A randomized controlled trial tested the connection between sugar consumption and stress response. 19 young women were given beverages sweetened with either aspartame or sugar 3 times a day for 2 weeks. Salivary cortisol, a stress hormone, and brain imaging tracked their responses. Compared to aspartame, sugar was associated with lower cortisol during a stressful cognitive task. There were also changes in brain activity, suggesting that sugar may calm stress reactions. No wonder it's so appealing and potentially addicting. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Anyone who has ever received care in a hospital knows that deciphering the bill can be incredibly challenging. Making sense of the charges seemingly requires an accounting degree. Even then, you'll have a hard time figuring out the actual cost of any procedure.
Americans are frequently told we have the best health care in the world. Whether or not that's true, it's indisputably the most expensive. Why is it so pricey? And is there anything that can be done about the cost of health care in America?
To help us answer these questions, we turn to Stephen Brill. He's a journalist, a lawyer, and author of America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Stephen Brill.
Thank you.
Stephen Brill, it's very nice to have you back on the People's Pharmacy. The last time we interviewed you, it was about your Time Magazine special report, Bitter Pill: Why Medical Bills Are Killing Us. And all of a sudden, you became the patient with a life-threatening illness. Would you please tell us about your experience and why you chose to write America's Bitter Pill?
Well, as I was finishing all the reporting for the book, which, as you know, is about all the orgy of lobbying over Obamacare and how Obamacare works and how it doesn't work and how it fits into the context of the outrageous healthcare prices that I had encountered and now expand on from the Time article. As I was finishing all that reporting, during a routine checkup, my doctor heard something that he thought was a little suspicious when he was using a stethoscope on my heart. And one test led to another, and within a day I was told that I needed urgent open heart surgery because I had something called an aortic aneurysm, which is a bubble that sits on your heart, and if it bursts, you die. You don't even get to the emergency room, and you have no symptoms. It's just something that apparently had been growing gradually in my chest. So there I was, in the midst of all this reporting, obsessed with medical costs and hospital bills and hospitals over-testing patients, suddenly lying on a gurney in a hospital, facing a big bill, being tested, not knowing if I was being over-tested. But what I realized was an emotional component of what I had realized as a reporter, which is when you are a patient, you don't care about cost, you don't understand cost, you don't understand need, you just know you're scared, and you will do whatever they tell you to do and pay whatever they tell you to pay.
And I imagine that that's part of what drives the fact that we have the most expensive health care in the world.
Well, there are two things taken together that drive that. One is that notion that as a consumer of health care, you're not really a consumer the way we think of consumers. We like to think of our country as having the most vibrant, competitive, free marketplace in the world. Yet when it comes to healthcare, which is literally 1/6 of our economy, we don't have a competitive marketplace because consumers have no knowledge, no leverage, and no power. It's not like you wake up one morning and say, gee, I think I'll wander down to the emergency room and see what they have on sale, and if I don't like the prices, I'll go across the street to the other emergency room and see what they have. It's not like buying a cell phone where, you can go to the Verizon store, you can go to Apple, you can go to Consumer Reports and see which one is supposedly, better, which is a better deal in terms of price. You can even decide with a cell phone, they're both too expensive. I'm not going to get one. I'll keep the old phone. With healthcare, you have none of that knowledge and none of that leverage. So when you combine that with the distinctly American notion or American illusion that healthcare can be a marketplace the way everything else is a marketplace. No other country treats healthcare as a private marketplace product, but in America we do. So when you combine those two things, what you get are outrageous prices because everybody on the selling side can has basically found they can do whatever they want. They can charge whatever they want, and no one's going to complain, and no one's going to be able to complain.
Stephen Brill, you have criticized the overuse of high-tech procedures like MRIs, CT scans, and goodness knows what else as part of the reason our bills are so high in this country. And yet when it came to your situation, an MRI probably saved your life.
That is true. And that's sort of one of the great, as a general matter, one of the great ironies of what I write about in the book, which is that the healthcare marketplace is completely abusive. To be specific about what you just asked about, we overtest so much that we use CAT scans and MRIs at a rate per person of 3 times the rate than any other country does. We pay 3 times as much for each of those tests, and yet our results are no better. So that's one side of the problem. The other side of the issue is that, as you point out, it was the MRI technology, the MRI test, that played a key role in saving my life. So the dilemma we have here is it's not like, when you're writing about healthcare and you write about abuses in the marketplace, you're also writing about people who, when they get up in the morning and go to work, they're going to work to cure the sick. It's not like they're getting up in the morning and going to work and making, porn movies or something. They're doing God's work. It's just that in any situation I've found, and I started to find this a long time ago when I was writing about lawyers and televising lawyers, that wherever you have power that is just not accountable, even good people doing good things tend to abuse that power.
Mr. Brill, you have written about your experience. In Time magazine, a wonderful cover story, What I Learned from My $190,000 Open Heart Surgery. Please tell us, what did you learn?
The solution that I sort of came up with while I was going through this process is spelled out in some detail in the book, but what I really sort of came to understand were 2 things. One, again, that when you're a patient in that situation, you are not a consumer. You are not able to participate in a marketplace the way, Americans, like to think the marketplace works or a marketplace works. Second, when I saw all the great care that was given to me and enjoyed all that great care, I began to think that what a better solution to what we're doing than what we're doing today is to allow the hospitals like the one I was in, which is big and has expanded and now owns a lot of doctors' practices and a lot of outpatient clinics, would be to let them expand and let me buy insurance from them instead of from an insurance company and cut out the middleman, as long as when you let them expand and take over a market, you regulate them very, very heavily. And to the extent I've gotten any criticism of the book, it's been that some people say that I'm naive about the idea that you could ever regulate hospitals that way. And that may be true, but look at what we're doing today. We're not regulating insurance companies. We're not regulating drug companies. We're not regulating anybody. And as a result, healthcare is increasingly unaffordable. And Obamacare, which is really the focus of the book, Obamacare, while it was a great thing to give more people healthcare coverage, the result of Obamacare is that the federal Treasury will not be able to sustain it because it's the federal Treasury that provides subsidies for all those new people getting coverage so that they can buy their insurance, and the insurance companies are paying the same ridiculously high prices for everything that they've been paying for the last 10 or 15 years.
And the drug companies are making out very well. We'll talk in a minute about the backroom deals that were done to get the Affordable Care Act passed. But first, you've analyzed hospital billing for a long time. I'm curious, what did you learn about your own bill?
Well, what I learned was that it had, a lot of the very, very high prices and sort of irrational items and prices that every hospital bill has, because my hospital, like every other hospital, uses the thing that I made famous called the Charge Master. So that I sort of knew, but what really shocked me was that my insurance company, United Healthcare, only got an 8% discount off of those ridiculous prices. One of the things that hospitals kept telling me when I was writing and criticizing the Charge Master, charging $77 for a box of gauze pads or $2 for an aspirin, they kept saying, yeah, well, those are just our list prices, but everybody, especially the insurance companies, gets deep discounts. Well, United Healthcare only got an 8% discount off of my Charge Master. And what that in turn really taught me was that the very large and prestige hospitals that keep expanding, whether it's the Cleveland Clinic or New York Presbyterian or Cedars-Sinai or Yale New Haven or Duke Medical Center, they have much more leverage over the insurance companies than anybody understands, because you basically can't sell insurance. For example, in New Haven, Connecticut, you can't sell health insurance unless you have a deal with Yale New Haven, because Yale New Haven owns all the hospitals in and around New Haven, and they own most of the doctors' practices, and they own most of the clinics. So why should they give the insurance company a discount? And that, to me, sort of drove home one of the real kind of absurdities of Obamacare, which was sold politically as health insurance reform. And the notion of Obamacare was, well, you'd go on the exchanges and you'd have 5 or 6 insurance companies competing, to sell you insurance on the exchange, and all that competition would be wonderful. Well, the problem isn't the insurance companies being in a competitive marketplace. The problem is the hospital systems aren't in a competitive marketplace. So if you have a hospital system that dominates a region, and there are 6 insurance companies trying to sell health insurance in that region, the hospital can play off all 6 against each other, and none of the insurance companies has any leverage. If there was only 1 or 2, at least there it might be something of a fair fight.
You're listening to Stephen Brill. He's an award-winning journalist, a lawyer, and author of America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System.
After the break, we'll learn about the infamous Charge Master, the list prices hospitals charge uninsured patients.
Mr. Brill talked with the CEO of his insurance company to get an explanation of his hospital bill.
We'll get Brill's take on the pros and cons of the Affordable Care Act, and we'll also hear from Jonathan Oberlander about the successes and failures of Obamacare.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website where you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 993. That phone number again, 800-732-2334. Online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're talking about health care in America. How has Obamacare changed healthcare delivery?
Our guest is Stephen Brill. He's an award-winning journalist and author of America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System.
Mr. Brill, you've been talking about the Chargemaster document, and I'm not sure we all understand what it is. Could you explain it briefly, please?
Well, the Chargemaster is every hospital or lab company's set of list prices. Nobody can explain how they got to be there, and it's everything from $13,000 for one dose of a cancer drug to $77 for a box of gauze pads, or even in some cases $10 for something that on the Chargemaster bill says is a mucus suppression system, but is actually a box of tissues. Now, all hospital Chargemasters are different. They all have 10 to 15,000 items on them. They all charge different prices. There's no rationale. No hospital administrator can explain any of the prices because they don't have to. They've never had to. And it's sort of emblematic of the whole healthcare system in this country, which is people basically charging whatever they want and not being called to account for it. And the notion that having more insurance companies in the mix is kind of delusional, because the insurance companies are the ones who have to pay the bills. Where you need the regulation is for those who are rendering the bills. We need to control the profits and the pricing practices of so-called nonprofit hospitals, which are hugely profitable. We need to control the prices and the profits of all the drug companies, which sell aggressively all over the world, and in every other country where they sell their products, their prices are controlled. They make very good profits, but they don't make the exorbitant rip-off profits that they make in the United States, because we alone have no controls on those prices. Same thing goes for medical devices. As I point out in the book, we spend more in this country on artificial knees and hips than Hollywood takes in the box office. That is a bigger business than every movie made every year. We spend $85 billion a year on back pain in this country, which is more than we spend on all the city, state, county, and town police forces all across the country. Yet, if you talk to any doctor who knows anything about this, that doctor will tell you that half of the money we spend on back pain is probably wasted.
Stephen Brill, you had this amazing interaction with the CEO of your health insurance company, United Healthcare,
Right.
and you asked him about your bill. And
I'm glad you asked about that, because to me that was sort of like if you were going to do, sort of a 30-second commercial explaining how totally screwed up the American healthcare system is, it would be that scene. And what happened was, after I got out of the hospital and I was home probably the third or fourth day, I received in the mail 36 different first-class envelopes the same day, each of them from United Healthcare, each with a different item having an explanation of benefits. One was for a prescription drug, the other was the hospital bill, the other was one of the doctor's bills, the anesthesiologist, et cetera, et cetera. 36 different envelopes, which, by the way...
If nothing else, they could have saved a lot of postage by consolidating them into one envelope.
That tells you something instantly about the efficiency of the system, right? Okay, so I'm sitting there, I'm recovering, I have nothing to do, and I'm supposed to be the world's leading expert on healthcare bills, so I look at this pile, and I can't wait to open them. And the third envelope I opened, it said, amount billed, this is for a drug, amount billed, 0. Amount paid by insurance, 0. amount you owe $154.20. And I looked at it, and I looked at it, and I tried to decode it. I couldn't figure it out. I gave it to my wife, who's a lawyer and who's much smarter than I am.
And she said it's completely incomprehensible, didn't she?
She couldn't figure it out. So, as it turned out, before I'd gone into the hospital, I had arranged to interview the CEO of United Healthcare out at their corporate headquarters in Minnesota. And when I was able to travel, I went out to Minnesota and interviewed him about all the lobbying the insurance industry had done over Obamacare, what he thought the effects of Obamacare were going to be on the industry, et cetera, all that good stuff. And then at the end, we had a very good conversation. He's a very impressive guy. And at the end, I took out of my suit pocket the envelope containing that explanation of benefits, and I handed it to him. I said, "I'm wondering if you could explain this to me. My wife and I were just having a little trouble understanding it." And he opened it up and looked at it and looked at it and looked at it. His executive vice president, for public affairs, who was sitting in on the interview, I can see this guy is already contemplating what his next job is going to be for having arranged this interview. And he looked at it, and he looked at it, and finally he looked up and said, "I could sit here all day, and I couldn't explain this to you. I have no idea what it means. I don't know why they sent it to you." And I said, "Well, aren't you they? It's your bill. It's your explanation of benefits." And he had no explanation for it. Now, what does that tell you, in addition to being actually kind of a funny scene? What it tells you is that is probably the single most common communication to consumers of the largest product in the American economy, right? We get tens of millions of explanations of benefits. Everybody gets them. Nobody understands them. Now, that one type of communication to consumers, the CEO of the largest insurance company in the United States, in other words, the person who sends out more of those communications than anyone else on the planet, he doesn't even understand it.
Well, it sounds like all the rest of us are doomed, because if Stephen Brill and his brilliant attorney wife can't figure this out, and the CEO of the insurance company shrugs and goes, "I don't know what it means."
Yeah, well, forget me. If he doesn't know,
yeah, I mean, but that means the rest of us are never going to be able to figure out what our health care bills mean, whether they're fair.
And it's actually almost worse than that, because obviously after we finished the interview, his PR guy said, "Well, we'll follow up and we'll get you an explanation of what it means." And I ended up getting 2 or 3 emails with 2 or 3 different explanations, and finally they all just threw their hands up and said, "We can't figure it out."
Stephen Brill, I think a lot of people kind of thought that the Affordable Care Act, what's been referred to as Obamacare, was going to help a little bit, because so many Americans were, in fact, uninsured or underinsured, and that this was a way to increase the number of people who would, at the very least, have some kind of health care. And of course, it ran into huge headwinds. But there were a couple of industries that were in the back lobbying pretty aggressively for Obamacare. And I don't think the American public realized that, in point of fact, the pharmaceutical industry was really thrilled with the idea of the Affordable Care Act. And probably insurance companies didn't mind either. So can you tell us what kinds of deals were struck with Big Pharma and other industries that actually benefited from this Obamacare program?
Sure. I mean, the way I like to put it is we've become so dysfunctional in Washington, and Washington is so under the thumb of the industries that have the money to give campaign contributions and pay lobbyists, that what passes for so-called reform in Washington is the kind of reform that only those interests like. And the healthcare industry spends 4.5 times as much on lobbying as the next largest industry, which is the military-industrial complex. So that gives you some sense of their clout. So to answer your question, what kind of reform would the healthcare industry like? Well, how about reform that creates, at the government's expense, tens of millions of new customers buying all their products at the same ridiculously high prices that they are selling them for. I think Obamacare was a great thing on one side of the equation. It provides tens of millions of Americans access to health care that they didn't have. I mean, I met and wrote about a woman in Kentucky, for example, who is alive today because she got access to a doctor and then to a cardiologist, and ironically, they discovered in her almost the exact same heart ailment that I had. She'd be dead if not for Obamacare, and there are thousands and thousands of people like that around the country. That's the good news. But the bad news is that nothing was done about the pricing of health care. Nothing was done to control the costs, and all the industries that have been riding the healthcare gravy train, which includes everyone in healthcare except, ironically, for the nurses and the doctors, they just do better.
Stephen Brill, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Stephen Brill. He's an attorney, journalist, and author of America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System.
For a different perspective, we turn now to Dr. Jonathan Oberlander. He's professor of social medicine and health policy and management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His book is The Political Life of Medicare.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Jonathan Oberlander.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Oberlander, we've just finished speaking with Stephen Brill about his book, America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System. We are out about, 5 years with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, as it's also known. What are the successes and what are the failures of this legislation?
I think we can say with a lot of confidence that the American healthcare system is much less broken than it was 5 years ago. The Affordable Care Act got off really to a rocky start in the fall of 2013 when we had that disastrous rollout of healthcare.gov. Since then, its performance has actually been pretty good. We've reduced the number of Americans without health insurance by somewhere in between 12 to 16 million since 2013, and that really is a substantial improvement. Lots of Americans across this country who previously could not afford coverage, who could not get coverage because they had a pre-existing condition, they now can afford that coverage. They're buying that coverage, and the health insurance marketplaces really have been a success story. Somewhere in between 6 to 8 million Americans have gotten expanded coverage through Medicaid, at least in the states that have expanded Medicaid.
We should point out several states chose not to expand Medicaid.
We still have about 22 states that have not. So I think the expansion of access to health insurance is a success. There's no question about that. In terms of shortcomings, obviously that rollout at the beginning of healthcare.gov was awful by any measure. We should remember that even though we've reduced the uninsured population by somewhere in between 12 to 16 million, we still have around 30 million Americans who don't have health insurance. So most of the uninsured are still uninsured today. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, even though we've cut the uninsured rate by about a third.
So I think most people would agree that it was a good thing to insure more people so that 12 to 15, million people now have access to health care that they didn't have before. But, and there are a lot of buts here, the insurance companies have made out quite well. They now have a much larger pool of people who are paying premiums, and the government is contributing as well. Hospitals have made out like bandits. I mean, they now have lots more patients. In fact, most hospitals that are run well are really raking in the big bucks. Healthcare costs are skyrocketing. Pharmaceutical prices are unbelievable. If you have hepatitis C, somebody's going to pay $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 for a course of treatment. If you've got cancer, the costs of those medicines can be $10,000 to $15,000 a month. So it seems like, yes, we've got a lot more people who are covered, but can we sustain the cost?
There is no question that there is an unfinished agenda in American healthcare reform. We are a country that is alone in the rich democratic world in having a large population without decent health insurance. And so I think that has to be agenda item number one. We are also a country that far and away has the most expensive health care in the world, that spends about $3 trillion a year on medical care, that over $1 out of every $6 in our economy goes to medical care. And in the long run, we do have to do something to moderate healthcare spending. I think one of the underreported stories in the last 5 years or so is that the rate of growth in healthcare spending actually is not skyrocketing. It has been fairly moderate these last 5 years. And in fact, going back to around 2007 or so, really healthcare is growing at a rate right now that is much lower than what we've experienced historically. That's good news for Medicare. It's good news for Medicaid. It's good news for private insurance. It's good news for Obamacare. How much of that moderation has to do with what the Affordable Care Act has done in cost control is a matter of great dispute, and I don't think we know. What we do know is a lot of the slowdown is a product of the economic recession, the Great Recession in 2008 and 9, and what's happened thereafter. But even after we got out of the recession, we're still growing at a more modest clip than we might have expected. That doesn't mean we've solved the cost problem, not by any stretch. You're right. Healthcare is still very, very expensive, and certainly consumers feel that when they buy health insurance, when they get medications. And, we don't talk enough about underinsurance. And you asked before, what have we not solved yet? Well, we've got more people insured, but underinsurance remains a really important problem. And a lot of the health policies that people are buying in the exchanges actually have very, very high deductibles and cost sharing. And I think that issue of underinsurance is one that we're going to be grappling with for a while.
You're listening to Dr. Jonathan Oberlander. He's professor of social medicine and health policy and management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and author of The Political Life of Medicare.
Can you believe it? $3 trillion? I mean, I can't even wrap my mind around such a big number, but I can relate to this $1 out of $6 going to healthcare. That seems like a lot.
It does seem like a lot, and I think we also need to be concerned about the underinsurance problem that's so strong.
After the break, we'll find out about whether Medicare is sustainable.
Will there be enough doctors to see Medicare patients in the future?
What are the challenges for long-term care and nursing home care?
Why is the Affordable Care Act so politically divisive?
Dr. Oberlander will tell us what changes he would make if he were in charge of health policy.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like this podcast of The People's Pharmacy and want to continue the conversation, you can join us online at facebook.com/People's Pharmacy to share your thoughts or comments. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red-X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 993. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on The People's Pharmacy, we're talking about how Obamacare is changing healthcare costs in America.
You're listening to Dr. Jonathan Oberlander, professor of social medicine and health policy and management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research interests include healthcare politics and policy, healthcare reform, and Medicare. His book, The Political Life of Medicare. Dr. Oberlander, you are a specialist, an expert in Medicare, and you started this quest at a time when most people were pretty uninterested. It seemed like a boring topic. Now Medicare is front and center. Everybody's concerned, will we be able to pay for Medicare? Physicians just recently kind of negotiated, if you will, and arm wrestled Congress into changing the way they're reimbursed for Medicare. Can you explain that?
Sure. And first of all, I would like to say, you said that Medicare is boring. I grew up in Florida. Medicare is never boring in Florida, so it came naturally to me. But there is a formula called the Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR, that governs the annual update in Medicare fees. And this has been going on for a long time now, and the formula has really produced results they didn't expect. And so if we didn't do anything to correct it, on April 1st of this year, physicians who see Medicare patients would take about a 21% cut in their payments, which is a pretty big cut. And we go through this annual theater every year where there's a 15, 20, 25, 30% cut. And then Congress at the very last moment, or sometimes past the last moment, says, no, we're not gonna cut. And that's not really a very good way to run Medicare policy. And the question has always been, why don't they just get rid of that system? And the answer is it's a sort of budget gimmick that both parties have benefited from, because to get rid of it, the way the Congressional Budget Office, which is the sort of oracle that scores this, the way they do it, across 10 years would have cost $200 to $300 billion to pay for it, to get rid of that automatic cut. In a Washington that doesn't like to raise taxes, that is dealing with deficits, it's hard to find $200 or $300 billion. What has happened the last couple of years, because of that moderate growth in healthcare spending, it has become less expensive to fix and has gained new momentum. And I know many physicians and many health policy analysts thought this would never happen. The story that you would hear all the time is somebody calls God and they say, God, can you tell me, is the sustainable growth rate going to be fixed? And God says, yes, but not in my lifetime. So this seemed like a holy grail that nobody was ever going to get. And the fact that the House just has recently passed a bill that would take care of this is really extraordinary. And what they did is, as I said, the cost has become less expensive. So the bill was less. They offset part of the bill by charging higher income Medicare beneficiaries more for their premium. So that's part of it. But a lot of way they offset the bill is just not by paying it at all. And of course, if you don't have to pay for it, it becomes a much easier problem to take care of. So the good news from a physician perspective is we're finally going to have some stability if the Senate acts around this issue. The bad news from a national perspective is we just added, unless the Senate does something different, about $140 or $150 billion to the deficit.
A lot of our listeners are on Medicare, and they just want to know, is it sustainable? Will Medicare continue? Will they pay my medical bills? And will there be doctors to service my health needs? Because we keep hearing, doctors don't like Medicare patients. They're rejecting Medicare patients left and right. There won't be enough doctors.
The answer is Medicare beneficiaries should feel very good about their circumstances and the state of the program. And let me just say that we are coming up this summer on Medicare's 50th anniversary. And for almost all of those 50 years, people have worried about its sustainability. And yet 50 years later, it's still here. And that should tell us something. I think there are a lot of things to worry about in American health policy. The sustainability of Medicare really is not one of them. Medicare's rate of growth right now, spending growth, is actually moderate, very moderate. And part of that is the Affordable Care Act. And that's good for Medicare beneficiaries, as they know there's a lot of cost sharing in Medicare. Medicare has a lot of holes in it. And so if we hold down what the rate of growth is in Medicare, we hold down what beneficiaries have to pay for it. So that's a good thing. Medicare is a stable program. Medicare is a program that still has a lot of bipartisan support. The question about physicians, there are some areas of the country and particular cities where at times you'll hear people are limiting the number of Medicare patients they're going to see. But we are going to go from a situation where we had about 40 million people on Medicare in 2010 to nearly 80 million in 2030. I tell all my medical students, unless you're a pediatrician, you're going to be seeing Medicare patients. There's not going to be a choice because that's the aging of the population. Go to any hospital or to a waiting room. And so I think the access for Medicare beneficiaries is really still quite good. Not perfect. Again, in some areas there are some issues, but overall Medicare is in great shape.
Well, the baby boomers, of course, are moving into Medicare at a fairly rapid clip. And that baby boom is a great big bubble in our country demographics.
It is. And again, I think it's one we worry too much about. We are a young country, partly because of immigration. And so if you look at the countries of Northern and Central Europe and places like Germany, they're much older than we are, or France. And yet they spend much less on health care than we do. So demography is not destiny. It's not all about aging. We can absorb the baby boomers, the fact that people are living longer and are enjoying healthy lives longer. That's actually a good thing. We shouldn't see that as a problem, the reality that we have more people to take care of in Medicare. The problem would be if Medicare was not there to take care of them. One problem, too, that I will mention that we have related to the baby boomers, one is that our long-term care system is an area that needs a lot of attention, a lot of help. Most people don't have insurance for nursing home stays. They wind up on Medicaid. They wind up spending down their money and their assets, and it's very difficult. We have a lot of people who are institutionalized in nursing homes who probably could be getting care better at home. And we're trying to move in that direction, but there's a lot to be done. The second area is we really need more geriatricians. We need more physicians who specialize in the problems of the elderly. And the United States is really behind the curve in geriatrics. We need to think about putting more resources into that and getting more of our medical students to go into it.
Well, it's hard because in medical schools, primary care has not been rewarded, and geriatricians are, in a sense, primary care physicians. They're not dealing with younger people, but they're dealing with the same kinds of issues, but for an older population. They're not doing things. Because they're not doing things, they're not getting paid for those services. So dermatologists, orthopedic surgeons are making out quite well. Geriatricians, internists are complaining they have to see more patients faster, and it's very frustrating. How do we change that payment system?
You get what you pay for. There's a lot of talk right now in American health policy about developing a system that's more committed to primary care, that's more committed to keeping people out of the hospital, that's more committed to really addressing chronic conditions in an effective way. All of that involves primary care and making it more central to our healthcare system. But we are implicitly sending our medical students a message, and the message we're sending them, because they're well aware of the salaries, and a lot of them are coming out of medical school with a lot of debt. And the message we're sending them is we don't as a country value primary care as much as we value some of these other specialties. And I think if we want more students to go into that, if we want to develop stronger systems of primary care, we have to change how we pay for it and what we pay.
Dr. Oberlander, going back to the whole issue of the Affordable Care Act, there is a huge divide in this country. Those people who think it's a good idea and are glad that they now have health insurance. And then what I would say is probably close to the majority, and certain politically it's very unpopular. And there are people who think it is absolutely the worst legislation that's been passed in the last decade. And a lot of Americans think it's horrible. It's perceived as a huge waste, as a redistribution, as everything that's wrong with the current administration. They point at Obamacare and they say it's a total failure. How do you respond to that?
I think there is a tremendous gap between the performance of the Affordable Care Act and the perception of it. I would argue that its performance has been pretty good, maybe not great, but I think it's been very good, particularly in expansion of access to health insurance. You're right. If you look at the public opinion polls, they've been very stable, actually, the last 5 years. And more Americans oppose the law and dislike the law than favor the law. And that perception has not changed, even as millions of Americans are gaining health insurance coverage, even if, as we've discovered, that some of the myths of the law that drove the debate in the early days, pulling the plug on grandma and so forth, are nowhere to be seen because they don't exist. And yet, the perception remains mixed and very negative. And I think that speaks to a larger point in health politics and American politics, which is we live in a very polarized period in American political history. Democrats and Republicans in Congress are more polarized on ideological and partisan lines than at any point since the 1870s. And we had just fought the Civil War. And that polarization is in the public as well. And I think the biggest failure of the Affordable Care Act is a political failure. It has not developed the constituency, the political coalition that Democrats expected in 2010. Partly that's due to mistakes the administration made. Partly that's due to problems with the law. Mainly, I believe, it's due to the polarization of American politics. And the fact that today, 22 states, despite the fact that the federal government would have paid the entire cost at the beginning and 90% thereafter, have not expanded Medicaid for their lowest income citizens, shows you how strong that polarization is. And that is the greatest shortcoming of the Affordable Care Act, that political failure, and also its greatest challenge going forward. How does it overcome that polarization?
One of the biggest problems remains the unregulation, the free expansion of costs. So whether it's medications, which, now generic drugs are going up at an amazingly high rate. It's like, wait a minute, digoxin has been around for decades. It's an old heart medicine. How can you charge so much for this generic pill? But that's happening all throughout medicine. Stephen Brill has come up with what he thinks is the answer to the rising costs of healthcare. And he basically says, let the foxes run the hen house. Let the hospitals, in a sense, insure their patients. They have the incentives to hold down costs if they are also the insurers. And he points to the Cleveland Clinic as one example. Is this the solution?
It's a solution that other people are talking about in health policy, particularly large healthcare systems and hospitals. Their view is we're doing all these things already. We're taking on all this risk. We're managing population health. What exactly are the insurance companies doing for us? I think you probably can find some systems that can do that and do it successfully. I don't think it's a general solution. We've tried before giving medical providers in this country control over systems and handing them off the risk. And the fact of the matter is insurance is a risky business to be in. And while healthcare costs have been relatively moderate in growth the last 7 years, they're not going to stay that way. What happens to a hospital when those costs start going up? I do not think getting into the insurance game and literally taking over that business is a model that really is going to serve most hospitals well, nor be the template for most of the system.
So, Dr. Oberlander, if we put you in charge, if we made you the czar of healthcare in the United States today, how would you solve the problems of healthcare, and what would you like to see the future look like so that it will be sustainable?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would want us to remember that we haven't solved the access problem yet. We still got about 30 million people without any health insurance in this country. And in my view, that's 30 million too many. So we've got a long ways to go. The Affordable Care Act has taken a step forward. We've got a long ways to go down that path of universal health insurance. And I think we should not lose sight of that. On the cost side, I think we have to continue with what we're trying to do in the Affordable Care Act. Many of the experiments that have been unveiled, we just don't know how well they're going to work. Accountable care organizations and bundled payment, all these things we don't know. My own solution, and the only way we could do this probably is if somebody was czar, because it's politically too hard. I would like us to go to a system of what's called all-payer regulation that's used by countries like Germany that have multiple insurers, where the insurers get together with the providers in a given region and they agree on one price, no matter what the insurer is, for a service. that would allow us to hold down costs. And again, it would really address that problem of high administrative costs in our system. So if we could do that sort of regulation in our system, I would do it, but you would probably need Harry Potter's magic wand plus Gandalf plus other mythical powers to actually make it happen.
Dr. Jonathan Oberlander, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Jonathan Oberlander. He's a professor of social medicine and health policy and management at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His book is The Political Life of Medicare.
Earlier in the hour, we spoke with Stephen Brill. He's an award-winning journalist, a lawyer, and author of America's Bitter Pill: Money, Politics, Backroom Deals, and the Fight to Fix Our Broken Healthcare System.
And we'd love to hear from you. Have you benefited from access to health insurance as a result of Obamacare?
Or have your health insurance premiums been skyrocketing?
And what about the cost of your medicines?
If you are a physician, nurse, or other healthcare provider, what are your thoughts on the Affordable Care Act?
You can share your thoughts at peoplespharmacy.com.
That's all the time we have for today's show. Lynn Siegel produced the show. Al Wadarsky engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth Extra Care 20 cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The toll-free number, 800-345-7339. The website, uddercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 993. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can also share your own experience and thoughts on today's show.
Why not sign up for our free online newsletter? It'll be in your email inbox twice a week. You can also sign up for the free podcast of the show and never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. Makes it easy to share it with a friend, and it's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you so much for listening to today's show, and please join us again next week when you'll hear from Kelly Turner, author of Radical Remissions, about people who have survived cancer against all odds.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.